Everybody. I hope you're all doing well with all of the extra stressors that we're all living with at this point. And I hope the exam's going well for you. This week, we make a turn in the course material towards what I guess you could call the sort of dark heart of modern history, and certainly the dark heart of our class. And we're going to have to sort of be in this material for a few weeks here. So I wish that the timing were different. I wish that we had something a little lighter, a little less intense to discuss in the midst of quarantine, etc. But we'll get through it together. This stuff is dark, but it's also the most important, some of the most important material that we're talking about in the whole course. So we will we'll do it together. Let's talk about the end of the First World War for a second here. And I've hinted at this a little bit in past weeks, but I want to explore it in a little bit more detail right now. So from the vantage of 1918 and especially 1919, 1920, the world that had existed before 1914, right? The world that everyone who was really conscious could remember, right? Their childhoods, their young adulthoods, etc., their entire lives seemed almost impossibly distant. It seemed like the world as it had been was totally lost. As the French poet Paul Valéry declared in 1922, the war's cultural and intellectual scars define the generation who survived it. He wrote, "We are a very unfortunate generation whose lot has been to see the moment of our passage through life coincide with the arrival of great and terrible events, the echo of which will resound through all our lives. Among all these injured things is the mind. The mind, indeed, has been cruelly wounded." So today, I'm going to be discussing some of the psychological scars that Valéry is alluding to here, the despair of post-war Europe, and the ways various Europeans tried to make sense of a world that had lost all sense of order, all sense of reason, predictability. As they did so, they struggled with what Sigmund Freud had called a legacy of embitterment, right? A sense of rage, a sense of distrust that would yield very dangerous fruits in the 1920s and 1930s. Europeans looked at the world with totally new perspective in the 1920s. Science and technology, which throughout the 19th century had been this sort of great hope for the future, right? There would be a utopia in the future, and it would be based on scientific rationality, right? But after the First World War, people look at science and technology as tools of mass destruction. They think about tanks and flamethrowers. They think about poison gas. That is what science and technology has produced. European stability, right? Peace on the continent of Europe, something that's sort of taken for granted after the Congress of Vienna in 1815 that we talked about a while ago. After the Napoleonic Wars, for so long that's been taken for granted, and now it seems almost impossible to ever achieve it again. These are dark times, right? And we sense it in the era's literature. So consider William Butler Yeats, an Irish poet. His poem, The Second Coming, he writes, this is one of Yeats's most famous poems, and he writes it in 1919, right? Looking out on sort of war-destroyed Europe. Consider these lines. Things fall apart. The center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. The blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. Surely some revelation is at hand. Surely the second coming is at hand. Obviously, he's referring there to the second coming as predicted in Revelations, the book of the Bible. I think it's the book of the Bible. Those of you who are more familiar with the Bible will know for sure. But a description of the end of the world, right? The second coming, meaning the second coming of Christ, which ushers in the apocalypse. This is where Europeans' minds are in 1919. It's a sense of collapse, a sense of doom is apparent everywhere. We see it in music, in the work of the French composer Maurice Ravel. We see it in the visual arts. Consider, for example, the movement known as Dada. And Dada doesn't necessarily project a sense of doom and gloom quite as much as a poem like The Second Coming does, but it nonetheless suggests bitterness, detachment, a renunciation of all that seemed normal, right? That went without question in the old world before 1914. So let's think about Dada for a second. Here's some famous Dadaists, some of the founders of the movement. So Dada was founded in 1915 in Zurich, in Switzerland, by a group of European artists and intellectuals. And they had convened in Switzerland to intentionally avoid the war, right? Famously, Switzerland is the neutral power of Europe. Among them are Hans Arp, German poet, Hugo Ball, German poet and theater director, and the group's unofficial leader, the Romanian artist Tristan Tzara, who's in the bottom left here with the monocle. Dada is a French word for hobby horse, but that didn't necessarily signify anything in particular, right? It represented instead the group's resistance to reason or predictability and its embrace of the absurd. Dada's leading lights, they were vague about the movement's true purpose or its goals, going so far as to claim Dada has no meaning. But that was also sort of slightly disingenuous, because not having a meaning was itself a sort of theoretical or philosophical proposition, right? Dada has a point to make about the world that the First World War has created, right? It's a revolutionary approach to art. It's a revolutionary approach to literature as well, that rejects Western European values, that rejects the Enlightenment, that rejects anything remotely like reason or order or beauty, right? We see it intentionally lampoons some of the established touchstones of Western culture. Dada rejected traditional standards. One Dadaist famously proclaimed, "Beauty is dead." In other words, it was like anti-art. It was an attempt to upend or undo thousands of years of tradition in the arts. As Tristan Tzara put it, Dada was a protest against the civilization that had led to war. What good did the theories of the philosophes do us? Tzara asked. And the philosophes, remember, are the leading philosophers of the Enlightenment. Did they help us take a single step forwards or backwards? We've had enough of the intellectual movements that have stretched to the limit of our credulity and the benefits of science. What we want now is spontaneity. Not that spontaneity was especially useful, right? That's not what Tzara is suggesting. Rather, everything is inherently useless. Everything is useless. So why not have spontaneity? What's the point of rigor and order? What's the point of being bored with these sorts of things when you could live a more interesting life if everything was useless anyway? This is a loss of faith, right? This is a profound rejection of the powers that be across Western society, across Western civilizations. So Dada, as a sort of formal movement, fell apart. Its legacies are significant still, even in the 21st century. But it was quickly succeeded by another formal artistic movement, another aesthetic movement known as surrealism. Surrealism, you might be a little bit more familiar with. Some of the surrealist artists are more commonly known, I think. And surrealists sort of draw on Freudian interest in the unconscious world to try and get at deeper truths beyond reason, to try and move beyond this Enlightenment fascination with rationality, right? And they want to try and find what's deeper. So we see this, for example, in the works of Salvador Dali. This is Dali's The Persistence of Memory, probably his most famous painting. We see it in the works of Juan Miro. This is Miro's Harlequin's Carnival. And we see it as well in René Magritte's 1928 painting, The Treachery of Images, which depicts a pipe, as you can see, with the caption, "This is not a pipe." In other words, surrealists are suggesting that the world as we've created it or we come to understand it is uncertain. The correlation between representation and reality, which we sort of hinge our entire sense of ourselves upon, is actually not so steady. It can be eroded quickly. I can paint this pipe and tell you it is not a pipe. These are artistic declarations, they're aesthetic choices, but as historians, we can also see in them the legacies of war. We can begin to appreciate the psychological destructiveness of the First World War. We can begin to appreciate what it was like for generations coming of age after that war and trying to find something to sort of hold on to and coming up empty in many cases. As the Dutch historian Johan Huizinga framed it, we are living in a demented world, and we know it. Demented as it was, however, it was still necessary to try and rebuild the civilizations, the governments of Europe in the 1920s. So let's talk about that for a second. Let's talk about one particularly famous and doomed effort to do that. You'll recall in November 1918, just as the war is wrapping up, just before the armistice, the German Empire collapsed. And the German Empire, you'll recall from about a month ago, we talked about the unification of Germany, the empire was proclaimed in 1871, at the end of the Franco-Prussian War. And that empire has now collapsed. And so in the ashes of the German Empire rises a republic. And it's named for the town where its constitution was drafted. It's a liberal republic, so it's constitutionally based government. And that was done in Weimar. So this government is known as the Weimar Republic, and this era in German history is known as the sort of Weimar period, the Weimar era, or folks will just refer to Weimar Germany and it's sort of a second hand for suggesting that you're talking about this interwar period, the 1920s, after the First World War, but before the rise of the Nazi Party. The history of the Weimar Republic is one of just constant challenge and just profound existential challenge. In the wake of Versailles, in the wake of the treaty, right-wing German nationalists blamed the new liberal republic for Germany's defeat. Right, so in the immediate aftermath of the war, you have just this really significant political challenge from within. And these ideas become really widespread in 1918 or after 1918, and they become well known as the myth of the stab in the back. Okay, so throughout the 1920s, this idea gains traction. There's a number of different representations of it. As you can see here, the myth of the stab in the back is frequently associated with anti-Semitism, as you can see in the image on the right. So this sort of grotesque caricature of a Jewish murderer behind the back of the brave German soldier on the front. The image on the right here is actually not a right-wing image. It's an image of a left-wing party adopting the idea of the stab in the back to caricature what the Nazis have done to the Weimar Republic. We'll get there by the end of this lecture. So the myth of the stab in the back becomes popular among German conservatives and members of this new radical German right wing. These are generals and other sort of high-ranking officers from the military. It's popular among bureaucrats, university professors, the sort of intelligentsia of German society. It's absolutely popular among nationalists. All of these groups associate the Weimar Republic with defeat, with betrayal, with Jewishness, and at the same time that they're defending themselves from these attacks, the Weimar leaders have to defend themselves from the left as well, right? The Bolshevik Revolution has happened and the Soviet Union is being created. And there are elements within German society who are anxious to lead a similar revolt and create a similar civilization in Germany. So before we get to the Republic's ultimate collapse, right, these forces will undo the Weimar Republic. Let's just consider its brief life, some of its founding philosophies, and some of its inherent weaknesses. I'm going to come back to this image in just a second. The Weimar Republic was, like I said, it was a liberal government. It had a constitution. Its constitution proclaimed that political authority derived from the people. It granted suffrage to men and women over the age of 20. Power was shared by a president and a legislature. But liberal governance, as you all know from your own lives, right, is really difficult. It's a really hard thing to do. It forces competing factions to work with one another and to build coalitions. And that's very, very difficult to do in post-war Germany. The landscape was so fragmented that no single party claimed majorities, and the Reichstag, the German legislature, was divided into many sort of multi-party coalitions ranging from the reactionary right, the extreme right, the stab in the back group, all the way to the sort of communist left. So for the most part, power fell to liberals and to moderate socialists, but they're constantly trying to fend off extremists from both sides. Let's yeah. Oh. One second. So, on the left, yeah, let's start with the left for just a second. Sorry about that. On the left, the German Communist Party, known as the Spartacists, staged an uprising in Berlin. This is in 1919 to try and establish the Soviet-style republic. Here's an image of that Spartacist republic, or the Spartacist uprising. As you can probably tell, they derive their name from from Spartacus, who is a Roman slave who stages a slave rebellion in ancient Rome. Here's an image of their propaganda that proclaims, what does Spartacus want? And here we have on the left a young German worker fending off the many-headed Hydra, all of the forces in German society that workers, communists, are trying to work against. We have the Junkers, who are this old landed nobility, the capitalists, and of course the new militarists, right? All of these anti-left forces. So, in response to this uprising, the Weimar president, Friedrich Ebert, calls up the Freikorps. And the Freikorps is basically the closest thing that exists to a German military after the Treaty of Versailles kind of tears down the German army. But the problem is that the Freikorps is not an official state military. It's a paramilitary group, and they're fervently right-wing. It's made up of former soldiers. It's made up of veterans. Many of them are adherents of the stab in the back myth. Many of them hate the Weimar government, but they also hate communists. And so they agree, they come up, there's 400,000 members of the Freikorps, it's quite large, much larger than the official German army. And there's a series of brutal, merciless struggles in Berlin and Munich and elsewhere that result in the crushing of the communists. And this is all just in the first year of the Weimar Republic. And these events have profound consequences for the German psyche. There are fears of communist uprisings will exist all the way through the history of the Weimar Republic. And they will continue well into the Nazi era as well, throughout the Nazi era, frankly. These fears never really go away, and they especially haunt the German middle and upper classes who know that the communists are coming for them, or who fear most that the communists would come to them, right? This poster sort of evokes for us this fear. It reads, "The Spartacist at work." And the Spartacist, who I think kind of looks like a vampire or a zombie, some sort of monstrous figure, strangles a man to death as a woman and child lie dead in a pool of blood. And it is signed here at the bottom, the Association for Combating Bolshevism. These fears of communism are going to drive the German middle class and upper class into the arms of the growing right wing of German politics. Right? This fear of communism really can't be underestimated as an important spark for political alignment in the 1920s. So it's not surprising then that the next major threat the Weimar Republic has to face comes from the right, not from the communists. The communists are pretty well put down in 1919, but the right is only just really taking off. Ebert, again, president, is fearful of this Freikorps, this sort of monster that he's needed to depend on to deal with one problem is now its own problem. And so he orders them to disband. He says, "You're not needed anymore, you can go." But instead they march on Berlin and they declare a new government headed by a man named Wolfgang Kapp. And this is the so-called Kapp Putsch of 1920. Here's an image of this. Putsch, by the way, is a coup in German. A coup is an overthrow of a government, seizure of power, a forced, obviously, seizure of power. Ebert demands the army stop the rebellion, what army he has, which is very limited. And he finds that many of his military leaders actually support the Freikorps, right? This is a problem, is that there's so much overlap in hatred for the Weimar Republic between those who are still in the military after the First World War and those who are veterans of the military, that it's almost difficult to tell the difference between these two factions, to what extent they even are factions. But what happens is, what actually ends up crushing the Kapp Putsch and this new right-wing government that's established very briefly, is that workers declare a general strike and the entire economy shuts down. And in doing that, the Kapp government quickly loses power. Its leader is forced to leave the country. But the putsch itself sends this really ominous message about the future, right? What it's saying is the Weimar government really can't rely on the army, and it faces a severe lack of support from broad segments of the population. Okay, we knew that it lacked support from the sort of communist left, but now we're recognizing it lacks support from significant elements of the middle and upper class who are not necessarily opposed to this very violent uprising and seizure of power. And all of this that I'm talking about, these are major problems, right? This is just the political crisis. Okay, this is just sort of one front of the Weimar Republic's struggle to hold on to power. The Weimar government also has to deal with existential economic challenges that continually forced the government to struggle for its survival, right? So to finance its war effort, right? So let's go back to 1914, 1915 for a second. The German government had borrowed more than 100 billion marks, which off the top of my head, I read this recently, it's about, I think it was about $33 billion or so. And the Weimar government has to inherit that debt, right? That debt didn't go away once the defeat was assured. And the destruction of agricultural lands, the destruction of industrial manufacturing capacity during the war, those things force Germany into a trade deficit. The German people have to really import most of what they use in these post-war years because so much of their country is destroyed. So they've got a trade deficit, they've got a huge war debt that they need to pay. And in order to deal with these things, the Weimar government sort of uses one financial technique above all the rest, which is they start printing a lot of money. And the result is a disaster. I can move away from the kaput here. The result is what's called hyperinflation. And what that means is that the purchasing power of a single German mark declines until it's essentially valueless. In 1914, at the beginning of the war, German marks stood at a value of about 4.2 to the US dollar, right? So you needed 4.2 marks to equal 1 US dollar. That's relative comparative value, relatively comparative value. By January of 1923, so now we're about, we're really 4 years out from the Treaty of Versailles at the end of 1918. The value has declined to 18,000 marks for 1 US dollar. You would need 18,000 German marks to equal 1 US dollar. By August, still in 1923, you would need 4.6 million German marks to equal 1 US dollar. And by November, it's 4.5 trillion. Okay, an absurd currency devaluation. The situation is so extreme, actually, that economists coined this word, right? This is a word that you would see today in the study of economics. Well, it's actually coined in this moment, hyperinflation, right? It's inflation that's so extreme that it needs its own word. And unsurprisingly, the standard of living in Germany declines precipitously because of this. Germans can't buy life's necessities with their paper. They can't even buy a loaf of bread, right? You have images from this period of women just pushing wheelbarrows full of German marks to try and get something, anything, right? Here we see the true value of the German mark, which is to start a fire, right? This woman is lighting her furnace with cash, but it's so worthless that she might as well. This ends up being a sort of short-term collapse in the German currency. The economy ends up stabilizing by 1924. It ends up being fairly prosperous until 1929, when the stock market collapses in the United States and the Great Depression begins to set in all around the world. But the memory of hyperinflation is very haunting, and the Weimar leaders are never really able to escape it. Ordinary people lose confidence in their government. I mean, currency is, if we think about this, currency is an extension of a government, right? And your ability to use it reflects your confidence in your government. This is a lack of confidence. When you look at this image, if you are lighting fires with your dollars, you do not have faith in your government's ability to back up the value of those dollars. Again, this is another reason that many Germans begin looking for political alternatives to the Weimar liberal government. Okay, and again, they're moving towards a right a right wing that really captures a lot of people's imaginations. And there's one other reason that they do that, and that's the Treaty of Versailles. The Treaty of Versailles, which we talked about last time, its legacies haunt Germany in these years. Okay, this is probably the most profound political issue of them all in the period. The Allied powers had demanded that Germany pay a war reparation of 100 billion marks. And a Weimar official who pledges the government will pay the debt, his name is Walter Rathenau, is assassinated by far-right Freikorps members. Okay, and the problem, the issue isn't just a resistance to paying. Okay, the Weimar leaders want to pay. They want to be able to sort of build up good relationships. They want to move towards some sort of normal working of international governance, and they're murdered for that. But the state really wasn't going to be able to pay the debt anyway. Even when the government begins the process of repayment, it ends up missing its first few payments. And in response, France, remember France, bitter, vengeful. George Clemenceau, the old tiger, he's so hateful of the Germans. What does France do? It marches troops into the Ruhr Valley, which is in sort of northwestern Germany. It's an industrial heartland. It's one of the densest urban centers of all of Germany. And what the French are going to do is they're going to extract the wealth. Okay, they're just going to seize the means of production in Germany and run them as normal, but they'll get the profit. So if you won't pay us, we will occupy your valuable land, and we will make the money back, and then we'll leave when we've gotten our money. It's an aggressive tactic, and the Germans despise the French for doing this. I mean, you think about the politics of this. Not only is it outside of wartime, you're sending military to invade a country and literally take its money away from it, take its wealth, take its prestige, its power. But you're doing it, this is in 24, so you're doing it within half a decade from when husbands, brothers, sons were fighting these same troops. We're fighting French troops. We're dying. So it's a deeply personal affront. It's an economic affront. It's an extreme choice, as this poster proclaims. No, you won't subdue me, right? We see a German worker responding to French troops who are dehumanized. They don't even have faces, right? You have to stand up to these automatons. The Americans recognize the flaws of this vengeance-fueled strategy. The Weimar government, which up until this point had shown that it was willing to cooperate, was refusing to cooperate. They actually paid German workers with what little money they had to not work, to sort of shut down production in the Ruhr Valley as a sort of strike against this. And so the Americans and the British devise another plan. It's going to be a graduated repayment system. It's going to be easier for the Germans to pay it. And there's also a strategy where the Germans will be able to borrow. It's kind of interesting that they would do this, but they borrow the repayment money from the United States at low interest, and then they can make their payments on time. It's sort of a way of building up credit, I guess you could say, and stabilizing things, stabilizing relations, and then paying back at low interest over time to the United States government. And that works, right? For about 5 years, this plan is fairly successful. The problem, though, is that these German nationalists haven't gone anywhere. There's so much hatred, there's so much bitterness against the Allied powers over the war. There's the stab in the back myth that suggests the Weimar leaders had sold the country out. And there's a refusal to accept that this is how things should be. That's very common on the right. And we see this in this poster, right? It says, for 3 generations, you must toil. And what it's suggesting is that for not only for the rest of your life or the rest of your children's life, but your grandchildren's life, you will have to pay the Allied powers. That is not going to be a winning political strategy, right? And the right knows that, and they can exploit that resentment. This will be forever. What an ignominious defeat this is, right? And so this is the context in which extremist right-wing politics really begin to take shape. So we have the sort of failed cop putsch early in the 20s, but right-wing politics are just building momentum throughout, and they are able to exploit every one of these existential problems that the Weimar government faces. And at every chance they get, the new right will say, Weimar leaders are traitors, they're corrupt, they're Jewish, they're ineffectual, right? They're outsiders. They don't represent us. They're not true Germans. Okay, let's finish up with some thoughts about where this all goes. In Germany and in Italy as well. So, and as you can probably tell, the ultimate development here is the new political ideology of fascism. Okay, all of these kind of strands of right-wing thinking, the resentment, the nationalism, the violence, these things come together and they make fascist politics in the 1920s. Fascism existed throughout Europe, and it succeeded in many countries. It succeeded obviously in Germany and Italy, but also in Spain, in Portugal, in Hungary, in Romania, Slovakia. And fascist movements emerged in many other parts of the continent. You would probably be hard-pressed to find a country in Europe or throughout the Western world that did not have a fascist movement by the 1930s. So let's talk about what fascism really is first. Let's try to be as precise as possible. And then we can talk about a few case examples, Italy and Germany. Fascism is, above all, concerned with authority. Right? Fascists value the worship of authority, power, right? Will. In this way, it's representative. Sorry, everybody, I just lost my screen for a second, but I think we're back. In this way, it's representative of an ideology that we saw a bit of in Nietzsche, right? Nietzsche's fascination with the will and the Übermensch, who can overcome dreariness, drudgery, and create something new. Fascists sort of draw on that fascination with authority. It's intensely nationalistic. So that means fascism varies from country to country because there's different nationalist traditions that it draws on, but in every case, it is always intensely nationalistic. Fascists are not internationalists. Fascists aren't concerned with building bridges abroad. They're not concerned with diversity, except as things that must be destroyed, right? They reject liberal values at all times. They have no use for free speech. They have no use for individual liberties. They have no use for a free press, private property, any of these things. Instead of these ideals, again, they revere authority. It's all about authority. Their symbol, the fasces. I haven't taken Latin in a long time, but I believe that's how the word is pronounced in Latin. The fasces, F-A-S-C-E-S, is a bundle of rods that's bound together with an axe blade. This is an important symbol in ancient Rome that represents power, right? This would accompany powerful Roman Republican officials when they were in public. And so Italian fascists adopt this symbol which to them signifies everything that they care about, right? It is authority. Fascists venerate the idea of newness, regeneration, and again, this is sort of shading on Nietzsche. There's this idea that strength and power can be born out of the sluggishness of democracy, capitalism. Fascists are very historically aware, but in a sort of selective way, right? They draw, and this comes back to their nationalism, I suppose, but they draw from the past icons that have some kind of symbolic power, and they attach their movement to elements of the past that they worship, right? So the Nazis eventually create a new government called the Third Reich, right? And that's a sort of historically conscious name, right? There's a First Reich in the medieval period. The Second Reich is the one that Bismarck creates in the 1870s, and we're the third, right? We put ourselves into the historic German tradition. You see this as well with the Italians, right? They very self-consciously adopt a symbol from ancient Rome to suggest that they have inherited all of the glory of ancient Rome, and they're going to restore it, okay? And they're also historically aware of things that they don't like. Mussolini proclaimed that fascists are, above all, fundamentally opposed to the principles laid down in 1789, right? So fascism, he is saying, is a correction to the French Revolution. We don't want liberty. We don't want equality. We do not want brotherhood. We want something else. And they're very communal. Okay, fascism is an anti-individualistic ideology. As Hitler put it, fascists seek to abolish the liberal concept of the individual and to substitute for it the national community. Okay, nationalism and communal ethos. And the national community, Hitler says, is rooted in the soil and united by the bond of its common blood. And to display their commitment to the national community, they do things like this. You can see in the image here. They organize these massive rallies. They dress the same. They wear uniforms, so they diminish the difference between individuals. Consider this. This is a very striking image of fascism, right? These are Nazi stormtroopers gathered at Nuremberg for a rally. This is the opposite of liberalism. Okay, the individuals have no autonomy. They're merged together into something larger. They're united. They follow a single leader. And again, this core ideology of fascism is monolithic unity. There is one authoritarian leader. There is one party. There is one ideology. There is one nation, one blood. There is no difference. There's no diversity. There's no disagreement. Okay. Instead of liberal or Enlightenment rationality, fascists are intentionally irrational. They worship will, blood, feeling, instinct, action. For fascists, reason promotes doubt. It hinders action. And this is very appealing, in particular to young people, okay, to lonely, disillusioned young people who are scarred by the war and want to be part of something greater. In 1931, 70% of Nazi Party members were under the age of 40. Most were also members of the middle class. Merchants, shopkeepers, small businessmen, small farmers. This is kind of interesting to think about why that might be. And there's a number of reasons. One is in the uncertain economic times of the late 1920s and early 1930s, those who associated themselves with big business, right, the elite, they had less to be concerned about. They had less need to drift towards extremist politics. And the working classes sort of had political movements already, right? They had turned in many ways towards unions and towards socialism. But it's that middle class who feels sort of squeezed, and fascism speaks to those people. It's people who feel like they're overlooked, in the system as it exists, but feel themselves as the essence of the nation, right? And so the fascist movements especially focus on this vast middle class that's sort of amorphous and doesn't have a clear place in the political spectrum. Fascism is most famously associated, I suppose, with Germany, but it first emerged in Italy. Although Italy had been on the side of the victors in the First World War, right? They were one of the Allied powers. They still resembled the defeated nation after the war. There's food shortages, there's rising prices, there's huge unemployment, ascendant radical left policies, um, labor uprisings. Moreover, Italian nationalists felt enraged by Versailles, right? Even though they were one of the most important parties in creating the Versailles Treaty, they felt robbed. They were especially angry that they had lost some of their colonies in Africa. So there's a lot of resentment there. So even though this is one of the victor powers, you see a situation that doesn't look so different than what we see in Germany in the Weimar Republic. And this guy comes along and gives voice to these things. It gives voice to the resentment, to the anger that's in the air after the war. And this is Benito Mussolini. Mussolini was born in 1883. He's born to a poor working family. His parents were, his father especially, was stridently left-wing in his politics. And Mussolini himself was deeply influenced by socialist politics. He was also a reader of Nietzsche. And as he came of age, he became the editor of a socialist newspaper, a very prominent socialist newspaper called Avanti or Forward. When he becomes the fascist dictator of Italy later in his life, he actually bans the publication of this paper and forces it into exile. But Mussolini moves away from socialism during the war. He's a fervent supporter of the war, right? He really begins to adopt nationalist politics, and he gets expelled from the Socialist Party of Italy for supporting the war. And amid the post-war malaise in 1919, he begins to form his own political party, which is sort of revolutionary in some of the ways that it draws from nationalism. It draws from some aspects of socialism, even though it's very opposed to socialism. And he calls this the Fascist Party. And his promise to members of his party is that he will restore Italy to its rightful place in international politics. It will be a leading nation in the world. And he's drawing from things that we've talked about all semester when he does this, right? He has the sort of nationalist passion of Mazzini and the Young Italy movement from the 1830s, who he's very aware of course. He has an interest in the heroism of Garibaldi, right, the great nationalist of Italian unification. He even embraces the sort of violent nationalism of the Jacobins that we talked about several weeks ago. This appeals to a diverse range of people who don't feel like they've got a comfortable place in post-war Italian society. Intellectuals, veterans, certainly, students, young students who feel like they missed out on the war, right? He promises a future where they'll get a chance to have some glory, some heroism themselves. All of these different groups fall into the sway of fascist romanticism. And it is that, it's romanticism, right? It paints a sort of glorious picture of the past and of the future, and this is the direction that we are going to go. He truly seizes power when the middle class and the capitalists join him, right? It's one thing to gather up the support of the disaffected cast-offs of the First World War. It's another thing to begin capturing much larger, much more influential groups, and the middle class and the capitalists are that. And these groups see the fascist party really opportunistically, right? This is their best chance to defend themselves against communism. Again, the fear of communism, the fear of a Bolshevik revolution happening somewhere else is all over Europe in the 20s. And it drives a lot of groups who might not have been as extreme in their politics towards further and further extremes of right-wing politics to try and protect themselves from communism. In 1922, sort of emboldened by the support from capitalists, from the middle class, Mussolini leads 25,000 black-shirted fascists. They always wore this uniform, the black-shirted uniform, in a march on Rome. Here he is at their head. He's the one in the sort of civilian outfit here. And this is where things get kind of interesting, because the legislature could have dispersed this group, right? They easily could have. They still have a military. This isn't like the Weimar Republic where there's this little other option. But they decide not to, and they defer to the king. The king is Victor Emmanuel III. And the king is impressed by Mussolini, and his advisors seem to actually support Mussolini. And so the king asks this sort of upstart who just kind of marched into the city to be the prime minister. So the fascists have kind of bluffed their way into a position of extraordinary national power and authority. It didn't necessarily have to be this way. They could have been put down. Who knows what would have happened next, but it didn't have to turn out the way it did. There were other options on the table. The government refused those options, and suddenly the fascist party is the most powerful one in Italy. The liberals believe that once Mussolini comes to power, he'll grow tamer. They think that the job itself will make an extreme man less extreme. They're wrong. His party soon dominates the legislature. They begin murdering their critics, the king, the army, big businesses, landowners. None of them retreat from Mussolini even after he is murdering his critics. He projects to them order, authority. Yeah, he's rough around the edges. Yeah, he speaks a little gruffly. Yeah, he's more violent maybe than we would like, but he has order. He has power, and that's attractive. By the mid-20s, he's outlawed opposition parties. He has suppressed opposition papers. He's all but destroyed the unions unless they have an allegiance to the fascist party. He's arrested anti-fascists, if not murdered them. And in official posts in sort of every level of government throughout the country, he has installed fascists. And by 1926, we have in Italy a one-party dictatorial regime. So let's move to Germany. Adolf Hitler's early life somewhat paralleled Mussolini's. Again, born to an obscure family in Austria. He's the son of a small town's customs official. His parents died when he was a teenager, and he spent the rest of his youth sort of adrift in Vienna, in Austria, and Munich. He was an artist. Here's an image. This is a painting of the Hofbrauhaus, the famous beer hall in Munich by Hitler. And he was not without talent, as you can see. He was not an unskilled artist, but he was not skilled enough to secure an admission to art school in his late teens, early 20s. And so he becomes this sort of aimless, lost youth. He had been born in 1889, so he spends important years of his coming of age just kind of without purpose. So for him, the outbreak of the war, which comes when he's 25, is sort of like a godsend. It is, he later wrote, an answer to his prayers, because it's a source of meaning, right? It's something to do. We had a discussion several weeks ago about why Europeans celebrated the coming of the First World War. And this brings us right back to that, right? There's a number of people across the continent who were looking for something to do in life, right? Life in industrial capitalist societies, um, with few options, for many people was sort of boring, and it was aimless. Um, and Hitler certainly fits that mold, and he is very excited by the war, and he joins quickly, and he has some military success. He rises to the rank of corporal. He earns an Iron Cross for bravery. It's one of the most prestigious medals, um, that the German military gives. And after the war, he returns to Munich, and he helps to found a new political party called the National Socialist German Workers' Party. Um, the party is nicknamed by its critics Nazi, um, and that is a sort of diminutive term. It's meant to make fun of them, and they never really, as far as I've read, they never really used the term to refer to themselves. Um, and as you'll notice, you might notice that the term socialist is in their party name, National Socialist German Workers' Party. To be clear, the Nazi Party's use of socialism was not to affiliate them with left-wing politics. It's really the opposite. The social in Nazi ideology is always insular, right? It's always looking within, a reverse to the sort of welfare of the pure German Aryan people. The Nazis are vehemently anti-communist, anti-left, anti-liberal, as I mentioned before. 1 year after Mussolini's march on Rome, Hitler and the Nazis make a similar attempt, and this is the so-called Beer Hall Putsch in Munich in 1923. So just a few years after that earlier Kapp Putsch, that earlier right-wing attempt to overthrow the Weimar government in Berlin in 1920, Hitler leads a group to try and do something in much the same way, on an even larger scale. But the attack is not well planned, and Hitler is arrested. Here's an image from that day and some early Nazi supporters. You can see in the bottom right. A number of Nazi supporters are killed during the putsch. Hitler himself is arrested, and then he spends less than a year in prison, which is not a very stiff prison sentence for someone who tries to overthrow the state. I've read, that the conservative judges in the country were generally quite lenient towards right-wing politics in this way, right? And they viewed Hitler's attempt as far less seditious than they probably would have if he had been a communist. While he's in prison, he pens his memoir, Mein Kampf. This is a picture of Hitler in prison, right? You can see circumstances were not quite so dire for him there. This is obviously him on the far left. And he pens the memoir there, Mein Kampf, and the book becomes a bestseller. It popularizes Hitler. It popularizes his nationalist ideology, and very critically, it's the first platform he really uses to advance his hatred of the Jews and his conspiratorial anti-Semitism and his alignment of anti-Semitism with his hatred for the Weimar Republic, with his hatred for the Treaty of Versailles. And he also unveils his sort of broader racial theories, his ideas of racial hierarchy, his ideas of German white supremacy, drawing heavily from social Darwinism, of course. In Mein Kampf, Hitler denounced the pollution of the superior race. He calls for a purified, unified German state. And he becomes a prominent national figure for the rest of the 1920s. This sort of turns Hitler into a political celebrity. And as I said earlier, the economy did begin to recover, and there's about 5 prosperous years in Weimar Germany where the Nazi Party struggles to establish much support. The global economy begins to collapse in 1929. This is the onset of the Great Depression, and Hitler's party is there, and they're ready to pounce, right? They're ready to exploit this decline. German unemployment reaches 30% by the early 30s, and the Nazis become a wildly popular party, right? They're very skillful at exploiting resentment and fear and insecurity. Hitler blames the crisis on the liberal Weimar government. Again, he's drawing from the stab in the back myth to suggest that the Weimar leaders are somehow wanting Germans to suffer. He aggressively scapegoats Jews for the nation's hardships, accuses them of hoarding wealth, etc. And you can see here that so much of this depended on economic conditions beyond anybody in Germany's control, right? So these red blocks represent the percentage of the Nazi vote, and you can see it continually going up from 1927, where there's almost nothing, to 1932, where it's very high, it's almost half of the vote. And then the gray line is unemployment. So as unemployment rises, so does support for the Nazis. By 1932, they achieved 37% of the vote for the German Reichstag. That's up from 3% in 1928. And they become the largest party in the national legislature at that point. In an attempt to sort of build a coalition, Hitler is named chancellor. Okay, this is just think about how absurd this is. 10 years earlier, a man who leads an armed assault at the beer hall putsch in an attempt to overthrow the government is named the chancellor of the government, right? Hitler is the last chancellor of the Weimar Republic. And there's a sort of belief that he can be appeased. If he's given this position of authority, he'll slow down and he'll work with the other coalitions and he'll just try to govern the republic as it is. Obviously, he doesn't do that. We know that. Hitler cracks down quickly on socialists, on communists, on Jews, on liberal critics. In February of 1933, there is a mysterious fire that burns. Here he is being named the chancellor, by the way. That burns the Reichstag, which is the legislative hall, the center of legislative governance in the Weimar Republic. And Hitler blames communists for the fire, and he declares a national emergency. And from that national emergency, he begins to construct a new government. The legislature wants to appease him, so they give him as much power as he asks for. He is granted dictatorial powers. By July of 1933, all rival parties have been outlawed. The press becomes a vehicle for the Nazi party, and any opposition press is obviously silenced, and the Nazis become more popular than ever. Hitler begins to spurn the Versailles Treaty. He begins rebuilding the German military. Later in the year, he proclaims the Weimar Republic dead, and in its place, a Third Reich is born. And again, this is drawing on the history that he is sort of selectively and romantically depicting of German empires from the past. Reich is the word for empire. And Hitler is no longer the chancellor. He adopts a new title, Führer, or leader. So these guys were opportunists, right? They built their political movements on economic calamity and popular resentment, not unlike the Bolsheviks. You remember another person who was very excited by the start of the First World War was Vladimir Lenin. And next time we're going to discuss how these right-wing movements, as they take shape and build governments, compare with the Soviet Union under Joseph Stalin, the other great dictator of this era of European history. Okay, sorry about the technical glitch back there, but until next time, I I hope you enjoy the reading, and I'm looking forward to discussing it with you. Thanks, everybody.